It was a quiet Saturday morning. I had just brewed my coffee and stepped onto my porch to enjoy the fresh air. My dog, Max, a friendly golden retriever, lay beside me, his tail lazily thumping against the wooden floor. Suddenly, a squirrel darted across the lawn, and Max let out a single bark, just one. That was all it took. From across the street, my neighbor, Karen, stormed out of her house, her face twisted with exaggerated outrage. She pointed at me like I had committed a crime. "Control your dog! That noise is unacceptable!" she shrieked. I sighed, already knowing this wasn't going to end well. Karen had been a nightmare since the day I moved in. She complained about everything. My car parked in my own driveway, the color of my mailbox, even the way I watered my plants. But this was ridiculous. "Karen, it was one bark," I said, shaking my head. "It's not even early. It's 10 a.m. Her eyes narrowed, and she smirked as if she had just thought of the perfect way to ruin my day. "We'll see about that," she muttered, before stomping back into her house. I hoped that was the end of it, but I should have known better. 10 minutes later, I heard sirens. I turned my head, and sure enough, a police car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, looking slightly confused. I walked down to greet them, Max trotting beside me. We got a noise complaint," one officer said, checking his notepad. "A dog barking excessively?" I let out a dry laugh. My dog barked once. The officers exchanged glances. That's when Karen came marching over, a smug expression plastered on her face. She pointed at me and declared, "That dog is a menace to the neighborhood." The officers looked at Karen, then back at me. One of them, Officer Martinez, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were told there was excessive barking. Can you confirm how often the dog was barking?" Karen folded her arms and huffed. "It was loud enough to disturb the entire neighborhood. This is a peaceful street and I won't tolerate such disruptions." Her voice was rising, drawing the attention of a few other neighbors who peeked out their windows. I kept my composure and gestured toward Max, who was now sitting calmly, his tongue lolling out in a friendly manner. "He barked once," I stated flatly. "A single bark. That's it." Officer Martinez frowned slightly and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, a single bark is not considered excessive noise." But Karen wasn't backing down. "I have rights. I pay my taxes. That animal is a nuisance, and if you don't do something about it, I will escalate this matter." The second officer, a woman named Officer Reynolds, sighed and took out her notepad. "All right, let's be fair here. Do you have any proof that the barking was excessive?" Karen's eyes flickered with hesitation, but she quickly recovered. "I don't need proof. Just listen to me. That dog is always barking. Morning, afternoon, and night. I can barely sleep." Her voice had reached a near hysterical pitch, and at that moment, one of my other neighbors, Mr. Peterson, an older gentleman from 2 houses down, stepped onto his porch. "That's a lie," he called out. "Max is one of the quietest dogs I've ever seen." Karen's face turned red as she whipped around to glare at Mr. Peterson. "Stay out of this," she snapped. But the damage was already done. Officer Reynolds turned to him. "Sir, have you ever heard this dog barking excessively?" Mr. Peterson chuckled and shook his head. "Nope. I sit on my porch every morning, and that dog is better behaved than most people I know. If Karen's losing sleep, it's probably because she's too busy spying on everyone." A few other neighbors, now drawn by the commotion, nodded in agreement. Karen's smugness began to falter. "You all don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I have sensitive ears. Even one bark is too much for me. There are noise ordinances, aren't there?" She looked at the officers, desperate for backup. Officer Martinez sighed. "Yes, ma'am. There are noise ordinances, but they apply to continuous or excessive noise, like a dog barking nonstop for long periods. A single bark doesn't violate anything." Karen's jaw tightened. "So you're just going to let him get away with it? This is harassment against me. I pay my taxes. I have rights." Her voice was getting louder, drawing even more attention. That's when Officer Reynolds narrowed her eyes and reached for her notepad again. "Ma'am, You just called the police over a single bark. That's considered a false report. Karen blinked, suddenly realizing what was happening. Wait, what? Karen's expression shifted from rage to panic. False report? What are you talking about? I'm the victim here, she protested, her voice shrill. Officer Reynolds remained firm, flipping through her notepad. Ma'am, calling emergency services for non-emergency situations, especially with false claims, is a violation. You reported excessive noise when, in reality, there was only a single bark. That wastes police resources. Karen's eyes darted around as more neighbors gathered, murmuring amongst themselves. But I thought it was excessive, she stammered. It startled me. Isn't that enough? Officer Martinez shook his head. No, ma'am. Personal irritation doesn't constitute an emergency. We have real situations to handle, and false complaints like these take us away from people who actually need help. He pulled out a citation pad. We're issuing you a fine for misuse of emergency services. Karen gasped dramatically, clutching her chest as if she'd been personally attacked. A fine? You're punishing me instead of that noisy mutt, she screeched, pointing wildly at Max, who simply yawned and lay down on the grass. This is discrimination. I knew the system was corrupt. She turned to the crowd, hoping for support, but the neighbors only looked on, some shaking their heads, others barely hiding their amusement. Karen's breathing grew heavy as she realized she wasn't going to win this one. This is unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. But Officer Martinez was unfazed. He calmly tore the ticket from his pad and handed it to her. Ma'am, you're being fined for filing a false noise complaint. You can either pay it or dispute it in court. Karen snatched the ticket from his hand, her fingers trembling with rage. This isn't over, she hissed at me. You'll regret this. I raised an eyebrow, but remained calm. Karen, all of this happened because my dog barked once. You called the cops, wasted their time, and now you're being fined for it. Maybe, just maybe, you should reflect on that instead of blaming me. Karen's nostrils flared, but before she could say another word, another voice joined in. Honestly, Karen, this was ridiculous, said Mrs. Patel, the friendly woman from next door. You act like you own the whole neighborhood. Karen's head snapped toward her, but Mrs. Patel wasn't finished. Last week, you complained about kids playing outside. Before that, you tried to get the HOA to ban wind chimes. It's always something with you. More neighbors nodded in agreement. Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood peaceful, she sputtered. But it was clear no one was on her side. Karen's hands balled into fists as she scanned the crowd, realizing she had no support. The officers remained professional, but even they seemed tired of her antics. Ma'am, Officer Reynolds said, we suggest you take this as a lesson. If there's no real disturbance, don't call the police. Otherwise, next time, the consequences could be worse. Karen gritted her teeth. I pay taxes. I have every right to report noise disturbances, she spat, waving the fine in the air like it was some kind of injustice. And we have every right to fine you for wasting police resources, Officer Martinez replied, unfazed. You're free to dispute it in court. Karen's nostrils flared. She opened her mouth to argue again, but before she could, Max let out a soft huff and stretched lazily on the grass. The moment was almost comical. Karen had just made a huge scene over this peaceful dog. A few neighbors chuckled, and someone muttered, Guess we should all call the cops whenever her yappy little dog barks. Karen snapped her head toward the voice but couldn't pinpoint who said it. She was losing control of the situation fast, and she knew it. Karen's frustration boiled over. This isn't fair! I have to live with that thing barking at all hours, she shrieked, pointing at Max. But her argument fell apart when Max, as if proving a point, simply rolled onto his back, enjoying the sunshine. A few neighbors laughed, and Karen's face twisted with anger. Officer Reynolds shook her head. Ma'am, I suggest you go back inside before you embarrass yourself further. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Martinez cut her off. Unless you'd like to escalate this? Because continuing to argue could be considered disturbing the peace. His meaning was clear. If she didn't calm down, she might get more than just a fine. For a moment, Karen looked like she might explode. But then she snatched her ticket, turned on her heel, and stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard that her own little dog, a yappy terrier, started barking furiously. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Should we report that?" Mr. Peterson joked, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. The officers shook their heads, clearly done with the drama. With Karen finally gone, the tension in the air eased. The officers turned back to me, their expressions much calmer now. "Sorry for the trouble," Officer Martinez said. "Some people just look for reasons to cause problems." I shrugged. "It's not the first time she's made a scene, but I didn't think she'd go as far as calling the cops over a single bark." Officer Reynolds sighed. "Unfortunately, we get calls like this more often than you'd think. Some people just want control over everything around them." She glanced at Max, who was now wagging his tail, completely unbothered by the chaos. "Honestly, he's one of the quietest dogs I've ever seen." I grinned. "Yeah, unless you're a squirrel." That earned a small chuckle from both officers. As the police wrapped up, a few neighbors lingered to chat. Mrs. Patel smiled at me. "You handled that well. If it were me, I'd have lost my patience ages ago." Mr. Peterson nodded. "And the best part? She ended up getting fined instead of you." He chuckled. "Maybe now she'll think twice before trying to control the whole neighborhood." But we all knew the truth. Karen wouldn't change. This wasn't over. As the officers drove away, the neighbors slowly returned to their homes, shaking their heads at Karen's antics. I leaned down to scratch Max behind his ears. "Well, buddy, I guess we survived another episode of Karen versus the world," I joked. He wagged his tail as if he understood exactly what I meant. Just as I was about to head inside, I heard Karen's blinds snap shut from across the street. She was definitely still watching. I could almost feel her glare burning through the window. I knew this wasn't the last time she'd try something. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She thrived on drama. But today, at least, she had faced consequences for her nonsense. And that was a small victory. Later that evening, I got a text from Mrs. Patel. "Neighborhood gossip. Karen is furious. She's complaining to everyone that the police targeted her. She even tried to get people to sign a petition to ban barking dogs. No one agreed." I laughed and showed the text to Max. "Looks like your crime spree isn't over yet." He gave a big doggy sigh and curled up on the couch, completely unconcerned. The next morning I stepped outside with my coffee, enjoying the peaceful air. Max trotted beside me, his tail wagging as he sniffed around the yard. Everything seemed back to normal, until I noticed Karen standing at her window, arms crossed, glaring at me like I had personally ruined her life. I smirked to myself. She could stew all she wanted, but she had learned the hard way that false complaints wouldn't get her anywhere. As I sipped my coffee, Max let out a small yawn, and for a moment, I wondered if Karen would dare call the cops again over that. But this time, no sirens came, no officers arrived, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, she had been the one to suffer the consequences of her own actions. It was rare to see karma work so quickly, and I wasn't going to take it for granted. A few moments later, my phone buzzed. It was another text from Mrs. Patel. "Karen's still fuming, but she hasn't stepped outside all morning. I think she's too embarrassed." Victory? I chuckled and replied, "Let's call it a temporary truce." But deep down, I knew this wasn't the last time Karen would try to stir up trouble. When it came to entitled people, they never truly learned their lesson. They just waited for their next opportunity. And when that happened, I'd be ready. Some people will always look for ways to control others, but when you stand your ground, they eventually realize they don't have as much power as they think. Message to the viewers, Chuck readers. Always stay calm in the face of entitlement. Sometimes the best revenge is letting karma do the work for you.